Alright, the microphone's working. Week 13, we've only got week 13, 14, and 15 left. Your essay number 2 is due on Monday. Your cultural event is due on Monday. Both of those are due by noon. So if you've already completed the cultural event, the Dropbox is open. You can submit it at any time. We double check to make sure the Dropbox is there for you. There it is. It's in the cultural event folder. The Dropbox for essay number 2, I don't think I've posted that yet, but I'll do that today. I'll put it in the week 13 folder. So I will add it to this folder here. So for your checklist, you've got Norton Anthology, Introduction to our new literary time period. What's it called? Postmodernism. So we did modernism before the break, and now we're into our final literary time period, which is postmodernism. So we have an introduction to postmodernism in the Norton Anthology, and there are 2 chapters for postmodernism in the outline for American literature. All right, chapters 7 and 8. One of them is poetry, one of them is fiction, prose. So we're going to look at those today. Also on the checklist, you have a quiz for this week. I think it's 10 questions this time. You have 2 videos that are optional. We may watch the short one in class today. One of them is 2 minutes long, the other is 46 minutes. They're both dealing with postmodernism. We'll consider the 46-minute one optional, but if you want to learn more about postmodernism, it might help you inform your presentation, or, well, I guess not your essay, but it might help you inform your presentation. So you need to be working on that. That's on the checklist as well. Essay number 2 and cultural event assignment. Any questions as to what you have to do this week or in the coming weeks? After this week, all we have left is, I think, another quiz next week and your final presentation. So you should be working on your final presentation now. All right, figuring out how you want to tie everything together. All right, let's get into our new literary time period. Maybe if I type up some notes here, that might help. So it's postmodernism. Do we have dates? We know that modernism ended with World War II, right? And I believe that was 1945. If you were to look at the outline of American literature in the table of contents, chapters 7 and 8, they say American poetry, 1945 to 1990. And then that's chapter 7. Chapter 8 says American prose, 1945 to 1990. So the outline of American literature says 1945 for a beginning point and gives us 1990 as an ending point. Your textbook, on the other hand, on page 2255, says American literature since 1945. Since 1945. So there's no end point in the Norton Anthology. So I could put maybe in parentheses 1990 question mark or this question mark. All right, remember our first period didn't really have a beginning because we couldn't figure out how old the oral literature of the Native Americans was. We had no idea of how to date it because they didn't write it down. Well, we have a different issue with our most recent time period. We don't know when it ends. Right? Because when you're dealing with literary time periods, you're only really able to identify them by looking back. By looking back on these periods of time and seeing what the writers had in common with each other, what historical events were contributing to the literature. So it's hard to look at us today and say, we are in the literary time period of whatever. Because it's hard to look at literature's place in society and figure out where it fits. Because it's evolving, it's always changing. So the outline of American literature decided that it ended in 1990. Why do you think they would have picked 1990? Were there significant changes in literature or culture in 1990 that changed things? We know that World War II ended the previous period. So was there anything about our society? Because I don't know the answer to this question. I truly don't. I could maybe talk to the writer of that outline of American literature and ask, or the editor, and ask her why they picked 1990. But I don't know. Do you have any ideas as to why 1990 may have marked a shift in American culture or American literature? Y'all were alive in 1990, right? Not all of you? Some of you?
Could it be Operation Desert Storm, the war in Iraq?
Okay, that's a good thought. So there was American involvement in the war in Iraq, the first war in Iraq, right? Operation Desert Storm, Operation Desert Shield. And that was right around 1990, maybe 91. That could be it. That could have a lot to do with it. So American involvement in the Middle East. That's a continuing trend to today, right? So maybe they're saying that marked this new trend of America being at odds with the Middle East. The two cultures, right? Somewhat based on religion, somewhat based on resources and economics. That's a good thought. That could be part of it. Any other ideas? I can't think of any major literary movements or literary contributions or authors that kind of got their start in 1990. I mean, there are people like maybe Stephen King, but I think he was writing in the 80s too. But he became very popular in the 90s, so that could be, one contributor to literature that maybe changed things a little bit. His style was different than what came before him. But it's hard to know. So, does this time period end in 1990? I don't know. The Outline of American Literature seems to think so. The Norton Anthology just says since 1945 up until the publishing of this book, which was just released last year. So it's hard to say for sure. In 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, the Norton Anthology might say 1945 to 1990, or they might say 1945 to 2000. We don't know. So it's kind of like this open-ended thing. We don't know if we're still in postmodernism or if we're in a new age. And that leads us to a question. If we are in a new age, if we are not in postmodernism, what age are we in? And maybe before we try to answer that question, we should look and see what the context of postmodernism really is. So based on your textbook on 2255, it starts out with all the historical background. Anybody notice that painting on 2254? It's black and white, so it might not be as familiar, but we looked at this, I think, last week maybe. That's Jackson Pollock. That's the same one I pulled up, and that was just a coincidence. So it starts out by talking about world power. World power. What countries are powerful, what countries are not powerful after 1945. And it's all based on the results of World War II. So who won World War II? The Allied powers. Who are the Allied powers? I know the United States, Great Britain, France. What about Russia? Was Russia one of the Allied powers? You say that with certainty?
I believe so.
Okay. Okay, that would make sense. That would make a lot of sense. So let's just narrow it to those four then. There may be a couple others, but let's narrow it to those big four. United States, France, Russia, and what was the fourth one?
Great Britain.
And Great Britain. All right, so think about these four countries. They were the winners, right? Who were the losers? Japan, Germany. Are there any others? The Axis powers, right? Japan, Germany. I should know these. I don't. Sorry. You know who the Axis powers were in World War II? No? I wish Todd were here. You could go ask him. Resident history professor. Okay, well, let's just say Japan and Germany. We know for sure that they are two of the Axis powers that lost. So they're not going to have as much power in the world, right, after World War II. But the Allied powers, the ones that won, they should have power, right? They won the war. They should have power. However, France and Great Britain weren't doing so well. Why? After World War II. Say again?
Were they recovering from the past war?
Yeah, they were recovering from World War II. They got bombed to smithereens during World War II. Great Britain and France, they were destroyed. The United States, on the other hand, they were an ocean away. I mean, the only toll the United States took was soldiers overseas or Pearl Harbor, right? Pearl Harbor was just a large naval base the Pacific Ocean, right? So the country of the United States wasn't really demolished during World War II. Great Britain and France were. So even though Great Britain and France won, they weren't in very good economic standing, right? They had to rebuild their countries. The United States really didn't. And as a matter of fact, the United States had been rebuilding their country, or had been building up their country during the war, like creating these industries to, make tanks and bombs or whatever they needed for the war. Does that make sense? So that covers the United States, France, and Great Britain. What about Russia? Should Russia have power after World War II? They were one of the winners, right? So if you think about, eliminate Great Britain and France as being extremely powerful because they're recovering, right? They're trying to build their countries back. United States and Russia faced some demolition during the war, but not nearly as much as Great Britain and France. So you've got the United States and Russia now, after World War II, as the two most powerful countries in the world, and Russia united with other Soviet countries, right, to form the Soviet Union. You've heard that before. So you've got the Soviet Union and the United States are the two most powerful. You can't call the Soviet Union really a country, but we will for this class. They're the two most powerful countries, United States and Russia. So what follows? All right, what follows during this time period, 1945 to 90, or a question mark?
Cold War.
The Cold War follows. All right, so you have tension, right? If you have world power divided between multiple countries, especially two specific countries, they're probably going to be at odds with each other just because that's the way the world works, right? For some reason, people just don't get along throughout history. So the United States is at odds with the Soviet Union now, but it becomes a Cold War. And if you look at page 2256, it goes into a couple different topics. It talks about women's role and the role of African Americans in the United States after World War II. And remember, we've said before, I don't know how we got ahead of ourselves, but we did. We've talked about how women were taking a role in industry and in the business world, and they were working. So after the war, they didn't want to be relegated to just domestic status. They wanted to be on par with the men in their ability to work and do what they wanted to do. And then for the African Americans, they had been soldiers in the war or supportive of the soldiers in the war, so they felt like they should have equal status as well in the country. So now you've got that conflict going on within the country. But it goes on to talk about the war, and war is important, right? Especially when we get into postmodernism, because it changes so drastically. You go from these world wars where you have people shooting at each other. In World War I, you had trench warfare, where people are digging in trenches and, using chemical weapons and mustard gas and things like that. You've got war on the battlefield, and it completely changes during postmodernism. And Cody used the term Cold War, right? The opposite would be a hot war, right? A hot war is when you're on the battlefield and the guns are blazing and you're, throwing grenades, dodging missiles, things like that. Cold War is the exact opposite. There is no shooting. It's cold. Everything's kind of gone dead. There's no shooting, or there's a lot less shooting anyway. And what it became was an arms race, right? The United States tried to build up their power and their arsenal, and the Soviet Union tried to build up their arsenal, kind of just posturing, saying, we're bigger, we're stronger than you, but they didn't really fire any shots. Still a scary time, though. Right? Just because there weren't shots being fired didn't mean it wasn't terrifying. When you have two adversarial countries building stockpiles of nuclear weapons that could be used, potentially, that's scary. It could destroy the whole world, right? But then war changes again at some point. Okay, Vietnam War. I would say Vietnam War might still be kind of a byproduct of the Cold War, right? Because the Cold War was, why? Let me ask you this: why were the United States and Russia at odds with each other? Why? I mean, they were separated by an ocean. They weren't really battling over land so much, which is what wars have typically been over. World War II was about Hitler trying to claim land that really wasn't his, and killing a bunch of innocent people. But that wasn't going on between the United States and Russia. Russia may have had some issues with human rights. That's not exactly why they were at odds with each other. What was it? What was it that made Russia an enemy of the United States?
They were moving to Cuba.
Say it again?
They were moving to Cuba, like missile type.
Okay, that's a good point. So even though they were separated by this ocean, Russia had some influence in Cuba, which is pretty close to the United States. But still, you're getting to the point. You're getting to it, but you're not there yet, because Cuba still wasn't part of the United States. So I don't know if the United States was threatened by the Soviet Union as if they were going to move into the United States and take it over. It wasn't so much the threat of them taking physical land, I don't think. But you're right, Cuba was close, so that could be a contributing factor. But it was more than just the physical taking of land. It was an idea. What was the idea? Or the ideas that were at odds with each other?
Race to space.
Say it again.
Race to space.
The race to space. That came a little bit later, I think, like in the 50s. But that was still part of the Cold War, and saying like, we're better than you, we're gonna get to the moon first. That was definitely a contributing factor to this time period too. The idea of technology being able to take us to the moon, that's a big deal. Right? That was a big deal to people back then, being able to leave our planet. So that was important. But I still don't think you've hit on the reason the United States and Russia were at odds with each other. Why was there a Vietnam War? Why was there a war in Korea? Communism, that's it. So it's this ideological problem that the two nations had with each other. All right? Russia believed in this idea of communism. The United States didn't. The United States was scared to death of communism. Maybe because of the results that communist countries were producing. There were ugly results for most of the people in these countries that, instituted communism. So that's what it was, and that ties in Cuba, as you mentioned. That ties in Vietnam. That's why we got involved in Vietnam, because part of Vietnam was communist, and they were trying to move into another part of Vietnam. Same thing with Korea. So it was this idea of communism, very important to this time period. All right, after the Cold War, how does warfare change again? We go from the hot wars, World War II, we go to Cold Wars, and then to what? And this is probably after the war in Iraq. What's warfare like now? Is it Cold War? What is warfare like now? Why do we have troops in Afghanistan, and why did we have troops in Iraq recently? Were we fighting Iraq? Were we fighting Afghanistan? So what changed? Because we were fighting part of Vietnam, we were fighting part of Korea.
Just basically policing.
We're policing. That's a really good word, and the book mentions that too. The policing came during this idea of communism. All right, so I'm going to take you back. Forget about modern warfare. Go back to the idea of the Cold War. The United States became a police force for the world. And they did it, it says on page 2256, with the formation of the United Nations. They joined all these countries up that were kind of anti-communist or more Western. And the United States was the strongest one, so basically it was the United States being the world's police force, but they were doing it with some other countries, which was the United Nations. And that's when they were trying to prevent the spread of communism, and they were trying to stop things from happening. And honestly, part of that hasn't changed. Part of that sticks around till today. If you think about the conflict in Russia right now with Crimea, if you've been following the news at all, Crimea was part of Ukraine, which is a different country from Russia, which was part of the Soviet Union, that broke up in the early 1990s. So remember, we were talking about what may have changed to create the end of this time period. Early 1990s was the dissolving of the Soviet Union, and all those countries that were together broke up. So I think the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, broke apart from Russia. Now they have this little part, or had this part of land called Crimea, which was part of Ukraine. Russia moved in and took it. They just took it. Kind of like when the United States took Texas from Mexico. Just took it. So now we have America wondering whether or not to get involved in Crimea. Should we police Russia from spreading into other countries? Or should we allow them to just take over where they want to take over? What do y'all think?
No, we shouldn't butt out.
You think we should butt out?
Yes.
Why?
I don't know, I just don't think it's our business to be involving ourselves with Russia
Okay.
in any way.
Don't think it's our business to be involved with Russia. Fair enough. That's a pretty good argument. Anybody disagree?
I do.
Why, Cody?
I don't think we should police because it's not our problem.
Okay, so you agree with her then?
But in this case, if Russia got big, they'd be a very big threat because they want the old Russia back.
If Russia gets bigger and gets more land and more resources, they could become a bigger threat to who? To the United States or to other countries?
To the world.
To the world.
To the world, including the United States? They could become a threat, a bigger threat.
Well, they kind of are a threat, to be honest.
They kind of are. And that's the issue. Are they or not? Because if they're not a threat to the United States, if they're not a direct threat, should we be getting involved? And you obviously say no. And that's kind of the dilemma that our military has, that our political leaders have. They have to decide, are they a direct threat enough for us to get involved? Should we police these other countries? Do we have a responsibility to police some of these other countries if they're involved with treaties or the United Nations? And because there are treaties that say, if you attack this country, the United States is automatically going to defend that country and attack back. Like, it's an agreement we have with certain countries. Ukraine, I don't believe, is one of those countries. But there are certain countries that, Great Britain, I'm pretty sure is one. Canada is probably one. You know, if Russia decides to attack Great Britain, the United States, because of a treaty and an agreement that we have, says we're going to get involved. Is that something? Should we have these treaties? Should we have these allies? Or should we be isolated from everybody else and just say, you countries do what you want to do, we're going to do our thing, leave us alone. There's a country like that in the world, Switzerland. They don't get involved in wars. They don't get involved in treaties with other countries. What's that? It's a very small country. It's also a very wealthy country, for as small as it is. And maybe part of the reason it's wealthy is because they stay out other people's business. I don't know. But it's a question that remains. This idea of the United States becoming the world's police during the Cold War, trying to stop and contain the spread of communism. So policing, you know, when communist ideas moved into Cuba or moved into Vietnam or moved into Korea, you know, the United States trying to step in and stop that, even though it may or may not be perceived as a direct threat. You know, it kind of depends on your definition of direct threat. There's a term used in the 1950s, the Red Scare. Anybody ever hear of that? The Red Scare? It's like the fear of communism spreading into the United States was the Red Scare.
All these officials, they're all communists.
Yeah, and so people started thinking anyone that was a little bit different might be a communist, and they would call them a communist, and that person might get arrested. In Hollywood, they called a lot of the directors and actors and producers communists, and they would get blacklisted, and you know, they weren't able to participate with their companies anymore. So it was a very scary thing. There was a lot of fear in the country, and when there's a lot of fear, people perceive things as a direct threat. Whether or not it was, I don't know. You know, it obviously didn't end up infiltrating the United States to the degree that they thought it was going to. But whether or not they should have started policing the world, I don't know. But they did, and we still do. Right? The United States still polices the world, and that's why we have somewhat of a military presence near Crimea and all around the world. There are United States military bases pretty much everywhere, right? In Japan, in Asia, Australia. The United States has a presence everywhere. And it comes out of this period. Prior to this time period, we really didn't have that type of presence in the world. So whether or not that's a good thing, whether or not it's right or wrong, I don't know, but it's something to think about, and it has effects to this day. And that's why we have, I think I just heard recently there was an American ship in a sea near Crimea, and some Russian planes were flying near it or something, and there was about to be a conflict. So this stuff carries over into modern times. But we still didn't really talk about how war changed from hot war, Cold War, and then I was asking him the question, are we at war with Afghanistan? Were we at war with Iraq recently? We weren't at war with those countries. That's different than how war used to be. Even during the Cold War, we knew who the enemy was. We could identify on a map the country, and we could say the government of this country is our enemy. We can't necessarily say the government of Iraq or the government of Afghanistan are our enemies. Right? So the way that war changed, and even though they might be not the friendliest folks, it's not that we're at war with other countries' governments. We're not at war with the countries themselves. We're at war with these, what? Terrorists. Terrorists. So terrorists are not state-sponsored, right? They're not Afghani terrorists. They're just terrorists living in Afghanistan. They're not necessarily Iraqi terrorists. They're just terrorists living in Iraq. Does that make sense? So yes, they may be from Iraq, yes, they may be from Afghanistan, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're from Yemen and they're living in Afghanistan. They don't necessarily have ties to the government. All right, they are different in that particular nature. Does that make sense? And that makes war difficult to fight when you don't even really know what country you're fighting, and these people can move from country to country. Right? A lot of the terrorists move from Iraq and Afghanistan into Yemen, another country. We're not at war with Yemen, yet all these people, these terrorists, have moved into that country. That makes it difficult when they can just kind of bounce around. You can't really isolate them. Does that make sense? So maybe that's another reason that maybe that marks a new cultural time period, right? We've seen that wars have a huge impact. Like a lot of our time periods are framed by wars. Civil War, World War I, World War II. They're framing these time periods. So maybe this new type of war will frame the new time period. I don't know. That's just one issue, war. We went on at length about war and how that shapes culture, how it makes different people, want equal rights, like women, minorities, things like that. So that's very important. All right, moving on, it talks about, at the bottom of 2256, the last paragraph, throughout the 50s and into the early 1960s, social critics perceived a stable conformity to American life. Stable conformity. So after the war, they saw a stable conformity. Stability, conformity, 1950s. What do y'all think of when you think of the 1950s? What did the United States look like? What did people's lives look like? Stuff. Oh, I'm so glad you said stuff. Because it goes on to say, a dedication to an increasingly materialistic standard of living. Stuff. It's all about stuff. But it was stable and it was conforming. So most people were able to get stuff. The United States was wealthy, all right, based on the power that they gained after World War II. They had economic power. So it was wealthy, people could get stuff, they became materialistic, but it was stable. There wasn't a lot of contention, I guess. So that's important. What else do y'all think of when you think of the 1950s? What did our country look like? What did society look like? What did culture look like?
Traditional family.
Traditional family. And that would provide stability, right? And when you say traditional family, what do you mean?
Mother and father. Father gives birth. Mother takes care of the kid.
Okay.
You like the kids to go to school.
Okay, so a mother and a father in a household. Married? Okay, married mother and father with children. Father typically worked. Mother typically stayed home with the children. Good. That's a pretty good description, I think, of the family unit during that time. I think I may have showed you the example of Leave It to Beaver before. Did I show you that? A picture of that family, the Cleavers. And that was their setup. And where did they live? Do we know where the Cleaver family lived from that TV show? Not geographically, but just, was it urban environment, apartment, country? Where did Leave It to Beaver's family live? What was it?
Subdivision.
Subdivision, suburbs. I'm pretty sure you're right. I don't think I've ever seen a full episode of the show, honestly, but I'm somewhat familiar with it. All right, there's a picture of their home, I guess from the TV show. So it doesn't look like an apartment. It doesn't look like a farm, right? It looks like the suburbs. So this idea of suburbs comes out of this time period too. You didn't really have suburbs so much before this time period. You had country living, city living, right? The suburbs came out of the city living. Cities got too densely populated with people to hold any more, so people spread out to the outskirts of the city, and that formed the suburbs. That's important to this particular time period. Understanding what suburbs are, where they came from, and what life was like in the suburbs, right? Compared to urban living, what are the suburbs like? What are the characteristics of suburbs in America? Do y'all live in the suburbs? Where do you live? Brett, where do you live?
Live in subdivision.
You live in a subdivision. Not on a farm.
Basically.
Basically on a farm?
It is on a farm.
How much land do you have?
I mean, we have an acre, but there's farms all around us.
There are farms all around you. Okay, so you're like in this, kind of like a cross between the suburbs and rural community, right? Okay, fair enough.
I'm about 10 minutes from town.
It's Winder?
Yeah, from Winder or State.
Yeah. So Winder's like almost the suburbs, but it's almost the country too, kind of depending on where you are. If you're in a subdivision within Winder, I would say that's probably closer to the suburbs. You know, if you actually lived on the farm and you had multiple acres, that's probably more rural living. Right around here though, Oakwood, I would say it's mostly suburbs. You know, once you get out of Oakwood, then it becomes more rural. But what are the characteristics of living in the suburbs? Is it busy? It's quiet? Peaceful? Yeah, most suburbs are quiet, peaceful, as compared to the urban environments, which are busier, louder, noisier, more industry, right? More factories, things like that. So it's important. This can influence the way that people write and what they write about, right? Based on the environments in which they grow up. So that's pretty important, the idea of suburbs. All right, the idea of conformity is really important though, and it ties into the idea of materialism. So society wanted to conform, they wanted to be the same as everybody else because everybody else had a lot of stuff. So they wanted a lot of stuff too. So this picture of the home, you know, if your friend from high school got a job working at the factory and then ended up moving into a house like this, that's what you wanted too. You wanted to be like your friend. So conformity during the 1950s was really important. And it goes back also to that idea of the Red Scare. You didn't want to be different. You didn't want to stand out during this time period, because if you did, you got labeled as a communist. And then you got in big trouble. And the government would be after you. So that's another motivating factor to conform to society. You didn't want to look different. Anything that was different was scary. And anything that was different could be a communist, regardless of that person's beliefs, political beliefs, economic beliefs, things like that. So people were labeled as communists just because they were different, not necessarily because they actually, believed in a certain type of government. So conformity was really important. Materialism was really important. Made people want what the person next door had. If the person next door got a Cadillac, you wanted to get a Cadillac, right? You hear the phrase "keep up with the Joneses." I bet that came out of the 1950s and this idea of conformity. So that's really important. And that starts the time period, right? Because this is 1945 moving on. So at the beginning of the time period, the focus was on conformity. However, and this might be the most important idea for the time period I can give you, as the time period progresses into either 1990 or beyond, we move from the idea of conformity. Right, there's your picture of conformity right there. Right, traditionally dressed, the man's wearing his business suit, You know, the boys are wearing, you know, decent clothing, short haircuts, right? That would be conformity. And then you move into (1960s). Not as conforming, right? Look at that guy's sideburns. Those would have stuck out in the 1950s, right? Look at his haircut. It's not the same as the Leave It to Beaver boys, right? It's different. Clothing's different. He's got his layered clothing on, his necklace. This guy looks like he's still traditionally dressed, right? But for the most part, you've got the longer hair, you know, the facial hair coming in. So style and fashion can be important, and it can tell you things about culture, all right? So this is still the same time period, though. This is still postmodernism. So postmodernism moves from conformity to something different. What's the opposite of conformity? Rebellion. Rebellion leads to, I would say, diversity. The rebellion against conformity leads to diversity. So during this time period, we move from conformity to diversity, right? Conformity means everything's the same. Diversity means everything's different. And eventually, I think I showed you this picture too. Eventually, if postmodernism carries on into the present day, if it does, I don't know if it does or not, but if it does, we move from conformity to this. Is it loud? Big difference, right, between Leave It to Beaver and this family? Right, you said traditional family is what you think of when you think the 1950s. When you think of the 2000s, 2010s, a family might be more like this, right? Much less traditional, right? This is much more accepted within society and within our culture, right? So you have adopted kids, you have remarried couples, you have homosexual couples, right? Much different than the Leave It to Beaver family. Does that make sense? Single parent households become more prevalent as the time period moves on. What if postmodernism does end in 1990 though? Can y'all think of any families that we could use as an example to show how we moved from Leave It to Beaver into something different? I can't.
Al Bundy.
You know, Married with Children, Al Bundy?
That'd be close.
That's closer to Leave It to Beaver, though. It's a married man. Married. You've got the husband and the wife. The man works. The wife stays home, and they have kids, and they're all of the same race. That's actually pretty traditional, right?
Yeah.
What makes them different? The hair, the style, the fashion. The fashion for Al Bundy and Mr. Cleaver from the Leave It to Beaver show is still pretty similar, though. He would go to work wearing a shirt and a tie. Guys are lucky. Fashion doesn't change a whole lot for guys, right? I don't have to update my wardrobe very often. But going back to this question, if we're looking at how culture changes, specifically using the family unit as a measurement of change, but we say postmodernism doesn't end with this modern family on the screen now. Maybe it ends somewhere closer to 1990. I can give you one from the 80s. Different Strokes. Anybody ever see this show? It's actually a pretty funny show. It's from the 1980s. Here's the family. No wife. You've got a white older man, 2 adopted kids that are black, and I believe that's his biological daughter. So it's a mixed family, single parent household. That's way different than Leave It to Beaver, right?
When was
Much
the
different.
Brady Bunch? Because they're 2 separate families.
That's a good one too. And this is, you know what? I'm gonna have to start using TV shows to help identify cultural changes. But we can do this because TV is culture, right? Just like literature is culture. I mean, a TV show is like a book on TV, right? A short story on television. So it's perfectly acceptable to use these. But yeah, if we go back to the Brady Bunch, which would be the 1960s. What's that? Over here?
The daughter of that different strength.
Which one?
Go, you see it?
Down here? Oh, looks like she got arrested. That tends to happen with young television stars, right? All right, so here's the Brady Bunch. It says 69 to 74, so late 60s, early 70s. Family changes, right? You have a husband and a wife, and I believe they're both remarried.
I think so, yeah.
They both remarried because they had 3 kids
Yeah, he has
from
three.
from each marriage, and they came together. So you have a blended family. Now notice it's not as diverse as the Different Strokes family that came a decade later, but it's still more diverse than Leave It to Beaver, right? So you can see how things get more and more diverse just by looking at television sitcoms, right? TV is a reflection of our culture.
Didn't they have like a nanny?
Yes.
And the mom usually stayed home with the kids, and the show they had a nanny.
I'm wondering if Carol Brady worked.
I don't remember if she.
Because you're right, they did have a nanny there. So this one.
But she's in the middle, I think.
Yeah, that's her right there, Alice. And I'm not sure if Carol worked or not.
I can't remember.
I think maybe she did, but that would be important to show that women are leaving the home to work.
Yeah.
So these television shows are a great reflection of culture. All right, so these work pretty well to show you. And the thing you need to see is that during this one time period, it wasn't just all about conformity throughout postmodernism. It was a move from very strict conformity to diversification, all right, in culture. Does that make sense? Do we see that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? What do y'all think? What are the downsides of conformity? What are the downsides of the Leave It to Beaver family? No individualism. Is individualism a good thing or a bad thing? In your opinion?
I think it's a good way, but there's still walls that I think we can follow.
Okay. Think back to Emerson and Thoreau, right? The Transcendentalists. They were big believers in art, nature, and the self, individualism, right? They would have been all about personal expression, personal freedoms, things like that. So this idea of, conformity, diversity, it plays out throughout our different time periods, okay? And different authors have different views of it. So it's definitely important. All right, let's see what else is in the textbook that maybe we could talk about. It talks about the mobile society. And when it says mobile society, I think it actually has 2 different meanings. It's on page 2257. Mobile in the fact that most people were able to afford automobiles. Most families could afford an automobile in the 50s, 60s. So they were mobile because they had a car, right? That made people mobile. But the fact that they were able to get a car was an indication that they were mobile in society. That society had an opportunity for people that were poorer to move into the middle class. The middle class expanded a great deal in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The middle class blew up for different reasons. And people actually debate, what the major reasons were. One of the theories is that the redistribution of wealth allowed for poorer people to make their way into the middle class. And it stopped wealth from accumulating at the very top with like the top 1%. You hear that a lot nowadays. The 1% has over 40% of the wealth. So during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, high taxation kept the really rich people from accumulating all of the country's wealth. So the wealth was more evenly distributed, which means people in the middle had, if you want to think of the metaphor like a bigger slice of the pie, the economic pie, does that make sense? So you've got a bigger middle class. People were more mobile. They were able to move from one class into the next. Does that make sense? Sort of, a little bit. So they were mobile because they had cars, but they had cars because they were socially mobile. They were able to move from lower class to middle class. Does that make sense? So there's two meanings there. Also, the highway system, the roads that we use now, they were developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They expanded greatly. Major companies came about: IT&T, GE, RCA, IBM. And then we have, at the bottom of page 2257, ways of life consonant with the isolated, stable economy could not survive in the new atmosphere of American power and wealth. So we had stability and conformity at the beginning of the period, but they didn't survive. The stability did not last. The conformity didn't last. The passage from the 50s to the 60s marks the great watershed of the post-war half-century. Conflicts between conformity and individuality, tradition and innovation, stability and disruption were announced and anticipated even before they materially influenced history and culture. We've seen this story before. We've seen conflicts between tradition and innovation, between the old and the new. We've seen this, right? The Puritan period was all about tradition. The Revolutionary period was a reaction against that, right? Revolutionary period, they moved away from tradition and religion and they moved toward science and logic as explaining the world around them. It was a reaction against the prior period. This time, you have the reaction within the one time period. So the reaction isn't a whole new time period by itself. During postmodernism, you went from traditional life, conformity, to non-traditional life and individualism and diversity. Within one time period, you have a reaction. Does that make sense? That we haven't really seen. We've seen the reaction before, but it seems to usually mark this whole new period. This time, we're still within the same time period. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. All right, so a bunch of different conflicts. That pretty much covers the historical context for the period. And like I said, I can't really tell you for sure when it ends. Outline of American Literature says 1990. Norton Anthology leaves it wide open. So I did pose the question to you. Should it end in 1990? Should it extend beyond that? Are we? Who's right? Norton Anthology, that we're still living in postmodernism? Or Outline of American Literature, and we're living in something new that's been yet to be labeled? You think we're in something new. And why do you think that?
I think the 90s was not really have the culture that we have right now is a little different. So I guess
From the culture that preceded the 90s? How? Okay, so you think the culture is different, and I have to paraphrase and rephrase for the microphone. You think the culture is drastically different from where it was in the early 90s to where it is now, or where it was up until the 90s to now? Okay, so how is culture much different? Government and economy, okay.
And Cold War, I believe, because the Cold War kind of ended in the 90s. That's when the fall, and I believe that's kind of your ending point.
And I think the Outline of American Literature agrees with you. All right, so you've got the ending of the Cold War in the early 90s, and like Brett said too, you have that Iraq War, which may have had a major influence too. And I think that's probably why the editor of the Outline of American Literature picked that as an ending point. So that's pretty good support. But how else does culture look different now? If we want to say that we're living in a new period, a new era, what is this new era that we're living in? And you can draw on anything from culture, or literature would be nice if you know anything about current literature. Go ahead.
1993.
Speak up a little bit.
Websites.
Websites, internet, information technology. Much different in the 2000s than it was in the 80s or the 90s. Internet was actually born in the 80s. Did y'all know that? The first technical email, I guess, was sent in like 1983 or 84. You were able to, if you had, a little bit more money than the average person, you could get your newspaper text, like New York Times, USA Today, whatever it was. You could have that delivered to your computer online in like 1984. It was really weird. It was like the black screens with the green letters. You ever see those? And they would deliver the newspaper text to you. So you could technically get online in the early 80s, but it wasn't used by all of society, right? It wasn't prevalent. So just because something's invented doesn't necessarily make it cultural yet, right? When it's adopted by society, then it becomes a big deal. And that happened, like I said, in the 90s, right? Does that shift our literary time period, our cultural and artistic time period? And if so, why? I could definitely make a case for yes, it does. I don't know if I can make a case against it. What's that? It is. It changes everything, right? So how does it change literature then? Because this is a literature class, and we have to remember when we talk about culture, literature is part of culture. How is literature different now, based on the information age, based on the internet, based on websites? How is it different than it used to be? I mean, we could say the medium that we get it, the fact that we read more text on a screen today, whether it be a computer monitor or a cell phone or a smartphone, that's a big deal, right? The way that we actually get it. But what about the content?
There's a lot more articles. Things like Wikipedia, which can be edited by people.
Yeah, open sourced knowledge and reference material.
It's not real exact authors. Everyone that contribute to.
Yeah, Wikipedia is a big deal. It's a big deal that it's open for the world to edit and to update. Can you make a Wikipedia page for yourself? Can you do that? I wonder if you have to become like a recognized editor by Wikipedia before you do that. I want to make sure nobody has a Wikipedia page about me. I got to check that out. But that's a big deal, right? The fact that things are open source now, so they can be changed by anyone. What else about literature and the things we read and change? You said there are many articles now, as opposed to what before?
More books.
Opposed to books. That's a big deal too. What else?
Twitter is like more worldwide. People say like more about the whole world, like different cultures, different people.
So maybe we have more of a blend of cultures and blend of ideas because of the internet, because of information. Because it doesn't have as many boundaries. It still has some boundaries, right? You can't necessarily get the same stuff on the internet in China that you can in the United States because they block a lot of things. So there still are some boundaries, but it's also opened up the world to at least most first world countries and most open countries. So that's a big deal. But the idea about articles too, I'm thinking that could have something to do with society as a whole. I imagine, and I don't know this for sure, it may be, I'm sure some scientists or sociologists have attempted to prove this, but it seems like the current generation, millennials, Generation X, Generation Y, it seems like they've got some difficulty with their attention spans. Is that fair to say? I don't know if ADD is really more prevalent now, or if it's just more diagnosed. I don't know for sure, but it seems like either way, that young folks have a problem with attention spans, and maybe even some older folks too. So if that's the case, maybe that helps to answer the question why we have more articles rather than books. Right? Article doesn't take as long to read as a whole book. So maybe it has something to do with people's attention spans and being bombarded and saturated by media. Right? Go back to like the revolutionary period, right? If you wanted access to some knowledge about history, society, culture, you had to really go seek it out, right? You had to find somebody that had a collection of books, that had the right book. Take it all the way up into the 80s. If you wanted to find a book about a specific thing, you had to go to the library and go through what was called a card catalog, figure your way through, a bunch of index cards until you found the right book. Hope that the library had it. Then you had your information. Now, if you do one quick search on Google on whatever topic you're looking for, how many results do you get? Millions, maybe. Like that. So accessibility of media and literature is a big deal. It's all there. We have no excuses to be stupid or uninformed, except for laziness, right? All the information is at your fingertips, especially if you have a smartphone, at all times. But does that create problems? Maybe. Could create that attention deficit problem, right? We're unable to focus on one thing at a time for an extended period because there's so much information out there. You know, we're constantly bombarded with new information, literature and media. All right, what else? The book talks about literary developments. The outline of American literature, chapter 7 and 8. Like I said, one of them is regarding poetry, and the other is prose. For the quiz this week, you need to be very familiar with the different styles of poetry, and these are found in the outline of American literature. So there are different schools and styles of poetry that are found in that chapter. You need to be familiar with the defining characteristics of each. All right, so for instance, there's experimental poetry, the Black Mountain School, the San Francisco School, the Beat Poets, the New York School, Surrealism and Existentialism, Feminism and Women Poets. So be familiar with all those different types. There will be at least a few questions regarding the different styles of poetry. All right, that's a pretty good introduction, I think, to postmodernism. Do y'all have any questions about postmodernism or assignments or anything at all? Yeah.
Our essays due next Monday, right?
Your essay is due Monday the 21st.
Both of them are.
Both of them. Yes, that and essay number 2 and the cultural event essay.
I tried to go find the Dropbox because our syllabus says it was due yesterday.
Yeah, I should have changed it on the checklist.
On the checklist.
Okay.
Yeah, but then I just wanted.
Yes, it will be due on Monday, and I didn't put the Dropbox in there yet, but I'm going to do it today. So the Dropbox for essay number 2 will be in the week 13 folder. Get started working on your final presentations. That way, if you run into problems, you can see me and I can try to help you out before it gets too late. Remember, you're focusing on one of the topics from the list. If you've done essays on 2 different topics, you might be able to unite them if you choose the first topic on the list, which talks about how the literature and the authors from class have either challenged or reinforced your prior beliefs. Because then you can talk about the 2 different topics and how they both challenged and or reinforced your beliefs. So there's a way to unite them under that first topic if you want to. But get started. Try and look at the directions again for the presentation and make sure you're covering everything you need to cover. And you also need to get into Galileo and find a scholarly source, or maybe 2 are required, I forget, 1 or 2, to help you with your presentation. Because I want you to teach me something. That's what the goal of the presentation is. If you get up here and tell me the same thing that I've told you or that the textbook has told you, that doesn't do a whole lot for me. That doesn't really excite me or captivate me or grab my interest. Right? Telling me a bunch of things I already know is not going to help you achieve a good grade. But making connections that I may not have seen, or telling me how connections are important to you between the literature and culture and history, and how that's changed you as a person or helped reinforce your beliefs, that's interesting to me. Right? What you've gotten out of the class is part of what your presentation is about. Right? So just regurgitating information doesn't really tell me what you actually got out of the class. It just tells me what you memorized. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for higher level thinking. All right? Do y'all think you can do that? I hope you can. It's like 30% of your overall grade. All right, let me know if you have questions.